ladies and gentlemen of Tulane, friends and relatives, New Orleanians and old Orleanians. Thank you, Dean Cummings. I heard Congressman Mo Udall, late Congressman Udall, get up one time at a banquet where he had just been introduced. He said, of all the introductions I've received in my entire career, that was the most recent. But I can't afford to be as casual as Mo Udall could about such introductions, and I appreciate that, particularly the extravagant parts. I confess to feeling a little bit uncomfortable in this setting. I'm accustomed to being lectured at on this campus. Now here I am up here lecturing to. I wonder if there's been some revolution that I didn't notice. Maybe I now understand how my grandson James felt when he was baptized. He was 6 years old at the time. He was up on the platform in front of the church with the minister looking out over the congregation, when the minister seized him around the waist and held him up in order to sprinkle a little water on him. James felt he just had to acknowledge that he was in a peculiar, awkward position. He was up there horizontally suspended and looking out over a couple hundred people. He sensed correctly that he was not supposed to say anything. The minister had all the speaking parts, so he stuck out his tongue at the congregation. I'm sure I'm not as uncomfortable as James was. I'm in a dignified vertical position. I do have a speaking part. James's performance, I have to tell you, only took 2 seconds. Mine may take longer. I feel very lucky to have had a good many years as a network journalist in Washington, to have heard President Kennedy talk informally one afternoon before a group of NBC correspondents about Vietnam, to have interviewed Ronald Reagan on the deck of his swimming pool in California, to have interviewed Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel. But I find that some of the things I would like to talk about this afternoon are not about national or international politics. They're about New Orleans, about the time when I was learning how to be a proper, obnoxious journalist. I can probably claim to have been a journalist now for something like 68 years, which would take me back to a hand-lettered sheet I put out in the 6th grade of the Henry W. Allen School here in uptown New Orleans. It was called a peanut bag. And I circulated this sheet to my classmates. It had to do with things like who was winning at marbles and what boys were playing the freezy game with what girls, and who was kept in after class for shouting in the basement. And I assure you I felt as full of myself as any William Randolph Hearst. And then one day, Miss Olive Walker, a woman I revered, she was our homeroom teacher as well as English teacher, asked me to stay behind after class. And when the other kids had left, I was stunned to confront a flaming, angry Miss Walker. She castigated the peanut bag and made it clear to me that my news sheet was out of business. She didn't specify what she was apoplectic about, and I didn't have the nerve to ask her. Yes, ma'am was about all I could say. But later, after I had slunk out of the room, it began to occur to me that quite possibly she objected to my reference in a recent issue of the peanut bag to a popular 12-year-old young lady in the class as the dizzy blonde from the red light district. What Miss Walker didn't know was that I was as innocent as kids got back in 1932, which was quite innocent. There was a lot of stuff in the paper in those days about the city's red light district, but the papers were hardly specific about the activities there. I kept reading the papers trying to figure out what was going on. I don't think that at that time my mother had even enlightened me about the birds and the bees, although I had heard some wild rumors. When my mother did eventually hand me an awkward little booklet literally about the birds and the bees, I got the distinct impression she didn't approve of either one of them. And if anyone had told me that the birds and the bees were up to their tricks in the red light district and making money out of it, I would never have believed it. So I considered that fine language dizzy blonde from the red light district not as an accusation of sordid professionalism, but a testimonial to the glamour of the young woman involved. I suspect the object of this purple language took it home to her parents for discussion, and I suspect they got hold of Miss Walker, who came to the unfortunate conclusion that it was not well intended. I'm afraid Miss Walker didn't think twice about whether I was protected by the First Amendment. I didn't think twice about it either. Something like 40 years later, Libby and I were visiting New Orleans from Washington. We were invited to a Mardi Gras ball, and there I spied the dizzy blonde, even more glamorous than she had been back in grammar school. And she was by that time the wife of the mayor of New Orleans, Chet Myerson. I apologized to her several decades belatedly. She accepted the apology. We even had a dance together. And the moral of the story is, if you ever find yourself totally steamed at a journalist, do not automatically assume that he or she is just naturally evil, unprincipled, or sleazy. You must also consider the possibility that he is just innocent. As opposed to my 6th grade performance, I gave a better account of myself as a junior at Tulane when I got into trouble with the president of the university. I had been writing columns in the Hullabaloo, quoting an anonymous source to the effect that Tulane alumni, certain Tulane alumni, were providing economic support under the table to certain football players, an illegal subsidy. Tulane President Rufus Harris called me into his office to discuss these columns. Dr. Harris, as many of you might recall, was the dean of the law school before he became dean of arts and science, head of the university. And he was a gentleman of serious dignity, and I was very happy to find that unlike Miss Walker, he was not flaming. He spoke more or less in a tone of sorrow. At one point he asked me if I had any specifics, any names of alumni who were handing money to football players. He said I should turn such names over to him. So I gave him the name of the chairman of the Board of Administrators. Dr. Harris seemed to think I was being unreasonable. He murmured something to the effect, I couldn't expect him to go after the chairman of the board. Did I have any other names? Eventually, Dr. Harris suggested that if I planned any more articles on football subsidies, it would be helpful if I could hold off until after the LSU game, which being decently patriotic, I agreed to do. I came away, by the way, from that conversation with Dr. Harris very respectful of him, very appreciative. I was not making his life any easier, but not once did he question the free press rights of a student newspaper or an uppity student journalist. And I came away thinking that this is the civilized president of a civilized university, and that Tulane was very much in the big leagues. A few years after my brush with Dr. Harris, while I was at Wdsu, we got a tip from an anonymous source that the Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court had skipped paying his federal income taxes for the past 3 years. We checked the files in the New Orleans IRS office. As you know, you cannot get the particular returns of anybody from the IRS, but you can find out whether anybody has actually filed returns. And the IRS files indicated that the Chief Justice had been filing tax returns up until 3 years previously, but had quit for the last 3 years. And we broadcast that story, and a few weeks later, the Chief Justice resigned. I don't remember where the tip came from at this point about the Chief Justice, but I remember very well the quiet man who some years later set up a Meet the Press interview that generated huge front-page headlines. The people of Iran, the land once known as Persia, had thrown out their dictatorial Shah and replaced him with the dictatorial religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. In Tehran, a young band of revolutionaries had seized the American embassy and taken hostage 62 American diplomats. They were shown on television coming out of the embassy, their hands tied behind their backs and blindfolds over their eyes. 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks passed, months passed, and the American people and the American government didn't know what was happening to these people. Total silence surrounded them. One day in this situation, I got a phone call from a soft-spoken man with a foreign accent. He identified himself as an American businessman born in Iran. He felt that the American press were unduly hostile to the Khomeini regime. We had lunch the next day at a restaurant. He was an elegant-looking man, tall, dark, immaculately dressed. He had a gentle, almost sweet manner. He was very interested in Persian music and Persian poetry. He also had, I found out later, a beautiful Iranian-born wife, now American, who had gone to college in this country and spoke excellent American English. And I'm going to call this man Ben. And Ben and I and our wives were soon exchanging visits to each other's homes. So I got to know Ben fairly well, and he got to know me. Then one day, I didn't see anything coming, any journalistic rewards coming from knowing this man. I was curious about him, and I learned something from him about the Iranian Revolution. One day, Ben called me at my office out of a clear blue sky and said, "Bill, would you like to be in contact with Sadegh This was an astonishing question. Sadegh was one of the top officials of the revolutionary government in Tehran. He was in charge of the press. He was in charge of radio and television. To my knowledge, no reporter in Washington or Tehran had access to him or any other Iranian official. Ben explained to me that Sadegh had come to Washington some years previously as a young student. He was a political activist, openly opposed to the Shah, which took a lot of nerve. Ben had befriended him, being somewhat sympathetic to the Khomeini revolution or anti-Shah, and had given him some money on occasion to help keep him in college. And now, years later, Wdsu was a key official of the Iranian government. I told Ben, yes, indeed, I would very much like to be in touch with Wdsu. And he said, well, hang up the phone, stay at your desk, and in a few minutes the phone will ring, and I will be on the phone when you answer, and I will introduce you to Wdsu. I was startled at the sudden prospect of talking with an official of a hostile government halfway around the world that was holding American hostages. But I hung up as directed. A few minutes later, sure enough, the phone rang. There was Ben on the phone. He introduced me to Wdsu, to the voice of Wdsu. I lost no time in asking Mr. Wdsu whether he'd be willing to appear on Meet the Press, and he said yes, he would, about 3 Sundays from the date we were speaking. The interview was to be broadcast live, with Wdsu in Tehran connected by satellite to me and reporters in Washington. But exactly 24 hours before the scheduled time for the interview, we got an unwelcome shock from the Washington Post. The Post said that not only Meet the Press, but also ABC News was expecting to interview Wdsu the next day, Sunday. We were stunned. How did ABC get into the act? I telephoned Ben and asked him what was happening. Ben asked me a surprising question in return. He said, Bill, what network are you on? I told him that Meet the Press was on NBC, the National Broadcasting Company. He said, oh, as if he had received a revelation. My friend Ben and his friend Wdsu were so uneducated as to American networks, they didn't know which one Meet the Press was on. And Wdsu's staff in Tehran had been telling both the NBC and the ABC bureaus to come on in on Sunday and do the interview. They thought both networks somehow were involved in Meet the Press. Ben told me not to worry about the confusion. He'd straighten it out, which he did. All of a sudden, ABC found that its interview, which had materialized mysteriously a few days previously, had now dematerialized. ABC never knew that an Iranian-American businessman was pulling the strings. On Sunday morning, relieving our anxiety considerably, Wdsu showed up in front of the Meet the Press cameras. The satellite was working, which it didn't always do in those days, and he provided the first authentic information about the American hostages, creating huge black headlines in papers all around the country. The epilogue to this story struck a grim note. Wdsu had a streak of reckless independence. It had once made him daring enough as a young student in Washington to protest publicly against the Shah, which was taking your life in your hands. That same independence undoubtedly got him into trouble with the religious fanatics running the Tehran government. They may have discovered that he was not as hostile to the United States as they were. In any event, a few months after our interview, they threw him into jail on what appeared to be a trumped-up charge of treason, and a few weeks after that, they executed him. Wdsu was, without a doubt, trying to use American television. Perhaps he was trying to start, I don't know, some conversation, some reconciliation between the United States and Iran. Every person who talks willingly to a journalist or agrees to any kind of interview is trying to use the press, trying to get across his or her side to advance some idea. The most important thing journalists do is not to push their own ideas, but to bring other people up to the microphone and let them speak. When I wrote in the Hullabaloo about alumni subsidizing football players, that didn't come out of thin air. It came from a source, a knowledgeable person who was bothered about what was happening and felt it ought to be known. That person found in me a way to make it known. When somebody tipped us off about the state's chief justice not bothering to pay his income taxes, the source of that tip felt that people should know about it, and he or she used me to make it known. In my lifetime, my most satisfactory experience in being used as a journalist came during the racial revolution, the civil rights revolution of the 1950s. I grew up here in New Orleans, as some of you did, in a world of segregation. Separate drinking fountains, waiting rooms, lunch counters, separate streetcar sections earmarked for white and colored. When Louis Armstrong came back to New Orleans for a visit in the late 1940s, I was a radio reporter. Louis had single-handedly changed jazz, changed it with his trumpet and then changed it with his voice. When he arrived in the city, I discovered that he was not staying at the Jung or the Roosevelt or the Mondale or the St. Charles. Louis Armstrong was, as far as the hotels were concerned, black, and the big hotels would not let him in. He was staying in a Jim Crow hotel on Rampart Street. But one morning, by appointment, I knocked on the door of his hotel room. He opened it, his famous, cheerful smile surrounded by white shaving lather. He invited me to stick a microphone in his face. I immediately said, "Mr. Armstrong, I'll come back in a few minutes." He said, "No, come on in." He invited me to stick a microphone in his face, and while he continued to shave at a washstand in the corner of his bedroom, he answered questions. He talked about the old days of New Orleans, the competing jazz bands, red beans and rice, even the knife fights. And he made it all sound like a golden paradise. As a reporter, I did not editorialize, but I did explain to listeners the circumstances of the interview by the corner washstand. And Orleanians could ponder the fact that the world-famous Louis Armstrong couldn't get into any of the big hotels in his own hometown. One of my very worst moments in a lifetime of journalism came when I was editorial page editor of the New Orleans Item. A letter to the editor came in from a black man who said that during World War II, which had just passed, the Navy had trained him to be an electrician. He enjoyed the training and he enjoyed the work, and he was looking forward to returning to New Orleans because he would have a way to get an income that would give his family good support. He thought he would have a better job than most blacks returning from the services to New Orleans. But after the war, he could not go to work in New Orleans as an electrician because the white unions would not let him in. I scheduled his letter to go into the letter column a day or so later, but the editor, who always checked the editorial pages before they actually went into print, said I would have to take the letter out. Why? I asked. Because, he said, advertising salesmen for the Times-Picayune were trying to dissuade some major advertisers from buying space in the Item. They were telling these advertisers that the Item often gave favorable news treatment to blacks, that the Item was a pro-black newspaper. You don't want to advertise in a pro-Negro newspaper, they said. The publisher of the Item, which paper was struggling at that time to stay afloat and eventually went under, had reason to believe that the Picayune was having some effect with this argument. He worried that if the Item started publishing letters from blacks complaining about discrimination, it might play into the hands of the Picayune advertising department. So a black citizen of New Orleans could not get a letter about racial discrimination into the letters column of the city's most enlightened paper. When Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi, we decided to send a WDSU camera crew to cover the trial. Emmett Till, a young black man visiting back home from Chicago, reportedly had whistled at a white woman. Two white men, one of them, if I recall correctly, a deputy sheriff, were accused of this crime. When a black congressman from Chicago came down to monitor the trial, the sheriff's people escorted him upstairs to a balcony section reserved for blacks. The jury eventually acquitted the two accused, as usually happened in lynch trials involving juries. But at this trial, at least, something new had been added. There were cameras present to bring viewers into the tense inner sanctum of grim-looking white supremacists. In the 50s and 60s, freedom riders, black and white, rode buses through the South to test the newly established legal right to equal transportation. Here and there, the segregationists responded with rocks and baseball bats. Freedom marchers infuriated segregationist officials by trying to walk down the street in Selma, Alabama. And they were met, as you know, with police dogs and fire hoses. Southern radio and TV stations, brand new in the news business, were trying to figure out how to cover the tense, tumultuous situations. A Birmingham, Alabama news director sent a cameraman out to cover local racial confrontations, but he was sabotaged by his own cameraman. Somehow it seemed as if every time local racists were kicking and punching the freedom riders, the cameraman somehow missed it. His camera was somehow looking in some other direction. WDSU cameramen, bless them, whatever was happening, came back with pictures of it. At WDSU, when we got syndicated film showing, for example, blacks protesting at Nashville lunch counters, we used it in our local newscast. I will never forget watching that film as it came in and marveling at the courage of the young black men sitting down in places reserved for whites under local law, quietly demanding service. The only protection they had was the presence of the cameras. The pictures of blacks demanding rights, the black sequel to the American Revolution, made many white people nervous. One of the higher-ups at WDSU said they were inflammatory and we shouldn't be running these pictures. But Edgar Stern and Louis Reed, the station owner and the station manager, supported the newsroom's right to decide that these were news, and we continued to run them. There was one phase of desegregation in New Orleans that today hardly anyone remembers. The federal courts had set a specific time for the city to end segregation on buses and streetcars. There was no more omnipresent symbol of segregation than the movable signs that fit into the tops of bus and streetcar seats, one on each side of the middle aisle. The forward-facing side of the sign said whites, the backward-facing side of the sign said colored. As long as anyone could remember, thousands of Orleanians had ridden the buses and streetcars every day, dutifully sitting in front of or in back according to each passenger's skin color. What would happen when these barriers came down? I boarded the St. Charles Avenue streetcar to witness that moment. It had the usual mixture of black and white passengers, I guess about 2/3 white. At the exact moment set by the court, the motorman up front stopped the car. Then he walked down the aisle toward the back of the car. He picked up the segregationist sign on the left, put it under his arm, picked up the segregation sign on the right, put it under his arm, turned around, walked back to the front of the car, put these two signs on the floor of the car, started the car moving again. Nobody had said a word. No black passenger got up immediately to change seats. But later in the day, all over the city, a few blacks boarding streetcars and buses began taking seats in front. Quietly, the world had changed. And we don't remember that today because it happened so quietly, it didn't make as much news or as much history as, for example, school desegregation, which was another matter. For something like 2 years, federal Judge Skelly Wright, a native of New Orleans, battled to get a process of desegregation of schools underway. Every time he issued an order, the legislature in Baton Rouge would counter with new legislation aimed at changing the legal situation. And then Judge Wright would issue another order. I later counted up the on-air editorials that WDSU did on the subject of the long-running school desegregation crisis. There were 50 altogether, almost one every 2 weeks for 2 years. These were not heroic editorials. Judge Skelly Wright, in his desegregation decision, not only made it clear that school segregation was unconstitutional, he also made clear his personal conviction that it was wrong and immoral offensive to the God-given dignity every human being is entitled to. Our editorial rhetoric at WDSU was not that bold. We just kept pointing out that efforts to resist desegregation in Arkansas had only brought the National Guard down on Little Rock and made it look bad. When the legal battle in Louisiana came to an end, we kept suggesting quiet acceptance would serve the city better than appeals to violence. When a racist group, the White Citizens Council, put out a 10 most wanted list, 10 most wanted traitors to the South, Judge Skelly Wright was at the top of it. Beleaguered members of the school board, because they were indicating they felt they had to obey court orders, they were taking a huge amount of abuse, and they occupied 4 or 5 slots on the 10 most wanted list. As a spokesman for WDSU editorials, I managed just barely to get on the list at number 10. We got some nasty phone calls at home from time to time until Libby decided to take our number out of the phone book. Eventually, the schools desegregated. There were some angry people. There was some noise, shouting, hate signs, nasty language at the scene. But every morning, the federal marshals escorted a few little black kids into the empty classrooms, and the level of hostility never lathered up into the quality of a riot. I have to mention here as a footnote that during the 2-year battle, up to and including the day of school desegregation, the Times-Picayune dealt with the issue by not mentioning it. No mention, not once in 2 years. I still find that performance incredible. But I hasten to add that that was your grandfather's Times-Picayune, not the notably enlightened Picayune of today. I happened to tune in C-SPAN recently when former Vice President Dan Quayle was lecturing a group of senators about the history and the mission of the U.S. Senate. He made the observation that in one important respect, being vice president was not as satisfying as being senator. As vice president, you cannot make a move without consulting the president. As senator, you're autonomous. You are your own decision maker. And it occurred to me how much in general Americans prize independence, how much they like the idea of being their own boss, or if you can't do that, have a boss that gives you some leeway, and how much indeed journalists prize independence. I hear music in the words freedom of the press. When I see the American flag enjoying a good breeze, I think of it celebrating, among other things, the way the First Amendment invites American journalists to satisfy their curiosity, a process that may open up to public view a problem affecting college football, or the tax dodging of a judge, pivotal moments in an historic struggle for racial equality, or the views of an official inside a hostile revolutionary government halfway around the world. The American people understand, I think, that there's nothing more important about how they get their news than the independence of the reporters involved. A few years ago, I was making frequent lectures around the country, and the question I got most often, especially from college students, went like this: are you guys bringing us the straight news? Or is it being spun by the government, influenced by big advertisers, or hemmed in by the corporate managers of networks and newspaper chains? I could always answer, yes, we were bringing the straight news, that in decades of journalism I had never experienced successful manipulation by advertisers, politicians, or anyone else. I do not mean that that never happens. Of course it happens. When people have a sense of power, big advertisers, big politicians, whatever, some of them are going to try to use it to make the media favorable to them. Media critics, journalism reviews, the public in general needs to be on the lookout for conflicts of interest among journalists, the corrupt use of influence, journalists entering into cozy relationships. But I think the fact that I have never personally encountered such manipulation in a long professional lifetime indicates that it's exceedingly rare. I do remember once an NBC executive trying to put some pressure on my predecessor as moderator of Meet the Press. Some of you may recall him, wonderful, crusty little man named Lawrence E. Spivak. Spivak, along with Martha Roundtree, invented Meet the Press just as World War II was ending. The NBC executive, who was in New York, was talking on the phone with Spivak, who was in Washington. He was trying to persuade Spivak to invite a particular senator, a New York senator, as a guest on the program. The network executive did have one halfway decent argument. The senator was a nationally important figure, and he had not appeared on Meet the Press for a year or two. But Spivak wasn't buying it. The New York boss kept pushing Spivak to invite the senator. Spivak kept finding fresh ways to say no. Eventually, the executive got exasperated. "Larry," he said, "what would you say if I ordered you to put Senator X on the program?" After a slight pause, Spivak said, "Why don't you try it?" I don't know exactly what Lawrence Spivak would have done if his superior had ordered him to put a senator on the program. But the executive came to the conclusion he didn't want to find out. And that was the end of that. Obviously, I admire that prickly figure, the crusty American journalist. I hope to become one myself. And I have to tell you that one of my daughters, who happens to be here this afternoon, encourages me to believe I'm at least partially qualified to go in that direction. When I had a birthday recently, she semi-apologized for not bringing a poem to the occasion. She said she just had not been able to find a rhyme for the word crotchety. I first met a prototype of the journalist Cantankerosa in New Orleans, and I liked him immediately. When I was still at Tulane mixing philosophy and journalism, I was in the city room of the New Orleans States one day. The States was the afternoon paper owned by the Picayune, which competed with the Item. I heard the city editor of the States in the middle of a telephone conversation with a powerful politician at City Hall, a key member of the city council. Beneath the mayor, probably the most powerful politician in the city. I could only hear the editor's side of the conversation. His voice kept rising. Pretty soon he was shouting. And finally he slammed the receiver down. To my surprise, he had hung up on one of the city's top officials. It occurred to me that this editor, who often shouted at reporters, was being his usual unnecessarily churlish self. But I was also encouraged and happy to know that an editor did have the nerve to hang up on a major public official. There was power at City Hall, but there was also power in a newsroom. A few years later, when I first went to work for the Item, the paper published an investigative story about a New Orleans congressman owning a piece of slum property that was not decently maintained. The congressman wrote an indignant letter to the Item defending himself, pretty effective, well-written letter. And I told the editor the next day, it looked at me as if the congressman may have gotten the better of the exchange. And the editor said, "Wait till you see what we do to him tomorrow." I see the presence of crusty journalists here and there as reassuring, a sign that they have the elbow room they need. But I do not want to maintain that they're all a pretty sight. Nor do I mean to be defending wall-to-wall journalistic arrogance. There are good reasons why journalists today are rather low on the totem pole of popular opinion. Too many newspapers and television newsrooms are rushing out stories they have not gotten firmly pinned down. The most visible journalist used to be the reporter on the beat. Today, the most visible journalist is the talking head, sometimes the shouting head, with an opinion on everything and sometimes no visible means of intellectual support except having read the Washington Post. There are big-name journalists who make big money out of lecture fees and who get indignant when a reporter asks, "What organizations is this money coming from?" The argument for having journalist income open to public scrutiny is just as good as the argument for having politicians' income open to public scrutiny. I'm uneasy about the practice of digging into every politician's sexual activities. A totally reckless president taking advantage of a totally reckless White House intern is one thing. But do we really need to do what we did 10 to 12, 15 years ago when we waited outside the Miami Herald, I think it was, had reporters waiting outside Senator Gary Hart's apartment during the night to see if he would emerge, as they had been tipped off he would, from his apartment with a Florida model? I don't personally want to be on that ambush team. I don't feel that pure. I'm also not convinced that sexual purity and presidential greatness have any connection at all. I think you could make an argument to the reverse, but I won't go into that. Back in the mid-'80s, there was a time when 3 different newspapers in 3 different parts of the country were exposing the adulterous affairs of 3 office holders in their areas, governors and such. And behind the scenes, the 3 editors who happened to be in charge of the 3 investigations were each of them known to be actively engaged in adultery themselves. In one case, with a staff person that this editor supervised. There's something wrong with this picture. But I'm going to resist the old man's temptation to say that everything's going to hell in my profession beginning from the day I retired. I don't think any better newspapers ever existed than today's New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. The evening news programs of Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, and Dan Rather, very able and very decent journalists. Those programs remain high-quality windows on the world, although they're subject to some accusation of softening their news. Jim Lehrer of the NewsHour, Gwen Ifill, Week in Review, Brian Lamb of C-SPAN all preside over unhurried, responsible approaches to the news. Our free press system in general looks to me pretty healthy. There's a fair amount of investigative reporting going on. There are plenty of journalists who are unafraid of the president, unafraid of the governor, unafraid of the mayor, unafraid of the Teamsters Union, unafraid of Exxon or Ford or Bridgestone Firestone. There's one long-range danger, however, most Americans are not aware of, and that is in the lifetime of my generation, there has been a sort of dilution, a weakening of the constitutional structure of our press freedom. Newspapers are firmly protected from government interference by the First Amendment, as they always have been, but the newer media, radio and television, are not. The cloud over the independence of the electronic press means that the American free press tradition lost ground during the last century. 100 years ago, all of the nation's press was fully protected by the First Amendment. Today we have the printed part of the press fully shielded by the First Amendment, but another huge part, the electronic press, has only ambiguous protection. It leaves us open to the danger that in some future crisis, perhaps a crisis of war or depression or internal strife, some political turbulence, the government may be able to apply pressure to radio and television stations in a way that it could not apply pressure to newspapers. The history that got us into this situation is understandable. In the early 1900s, the technology of radio suddenly appeared on the scene. A few radio stations sprang up, initially broadcasting to almost nobody. It immediately became clear that to avoid chaos, somebody had to assign stations to different frequencies so they wouldn't be talking over each other. The government stepped in to allocate the numbers on the dial. The Federal Communications Commission came into being. Then, at that point, a doctrine developed that sanctioned government regulation, even of news content, something new. This doctrine holds that the government is allocating public property to radio stations, that is, use of the airwaves. Therefore, government has to supervise radio stations and television stations to make sure they serve the public interest. Nobody, to my knowledge, said as that doctrine was being formulated, wait a minute, you cannot put government in a supervisory relationship to American news media. And probably the reason nobody made that objection was that radio in its infancy did not look whatsoever like a news medium. Nobody recognized it as a possible news medium. It looked like a medium for music and entertainment. The technology didn't remind anybody of newspapers. There was this box in the living room with dials on it. Inside it, there were electronic tubes glowing. There were voices coming out of it, usually originating in New York. When this contraption first arrived, Edward R. Murrow, Eric Sevareid, H.V. Kaltenborn, Elmer Davis, Tulane alumnus Howard K. Smith, the great radio journalists of the World War II era, were nowhere to be seen. There was another thing that unsettled liberal congressmen and senators in particular, and made it hard for them to see that radio performed exactly the same function as the American newspaper. The big national radio networks that were soon in operation, the National Broadcasting Company, the Columbia Broadcasting System, had their headquarters in huge New York skyscrapers, just a stone's throw from Wall Street. And they had affiliate stations all around the country. This was big money. This was big corporate power. And the senators and congressmen have an instinct, and it's healthy in many cases, to regulate corporate power. So they saw radio primarily as corporate power, and not initially, certainly, did they see it as possible news media. On top of that, and probably even more important, there was a pervasive bias among opinion leaders, white-collar professionals, intellectuals, academics, and especially among print journalists, a pervasive bias against radio and later against television. The electronic media were not associated with the respectability and dignity of American newspapers. Television was the boob tube, purveyor of popular, that is, vulgar entertainment. If you watched television, anything but masterpiece theater, you became an instant redneck. I happened to be present in Chicago in the late 1950s when the head of the Federal Communications Commission at that time, the distinguished lawyer Newton Minow, addressed a meeting of television executives. He took them to the woodshed. He told them in a phrase now famous that their programming constituted a vast wasteland. Television programming was so popular at that time that the television audience was growing by the millions every year. But Newton Minow had no compunction in scolding network executives for not meeting his intellectual standards. He spoke for America's unofficial ruling class, and he was applauded by every newspaper editorial writer in the country. When I left the New Orleans Item years ago, just before it went down the drain, to become news director of WDSU, the editor of the Item, one of the best bosses I ever had, said that I was making a mistake. He said, "Bill, these are not your kind of people," talking about the ownership of WDSU. And I was a little bit startled. What did he mean they were not my kind of people? What he meant was that a newspaper is a newspaper. It had dignity, it had standards. But television people dispensed song and dance, low-life comedy. People were buying television sets to watch a woman named Dagmar who came on at midnight in low-cut dresses. As a newspaperman myself, and an intellectual confirmed by a Tulane degree, I had exactly the same prejudice. I knew that Edgar Stern, the owner of WDSU, was an upright human being, but I did not know whether I'd be completely proud of myself as a television journalist. Could you do satisfying journalism in the middle of television's three-ring circus? Not until I attended my first annual meeting of the Television News Directors Association did I quit worrying. I met one news director after another who obviously had the same journalistic ethics I was familiar with. All of us had brought these ethics over from newspapers. And Edgar Stern, as a matter of personal integrity, was just naturally inclined to his station's newsroom practicing ethical journalism. If you wanted to do an honest job of covering the news, you could do it in the pages of a newspaper or you could do it on a television screen. Different journalists can have different standards, but there is no ethical deficiency built into the medium of television. But that is the history, and that is the climate of prejudice that produced the anti-First Amendment doctrine under which radio and television are now functioning. And some effects of that climate are still with us. It ain't quite gone. Witness the occasional intellectual whose fear and loathing of television is so overpowering, he cannot have it in his home. If the opinion leaders and legislators of 70 and 80 years ago had foreseen that eventually more than half of the American people would depend primarily on television for their news, and if they could have put aside their biases, they might have taken a different tack than the one they did, a tack not subversive of the First Amendment. They might have asked the nearest law student to draw up a doctrine that said the government will allocate radio channels, but in accord with the First Amendment, it will not have anything to say about the content of what is broadcast. In other words, if Newton Minow wants to gripe about programming as a private citizen, fine, but as a government regulator, it's none of his business. As things now stand, we have American news media that are nervous about offending the government. Maybe they shouldn't be. It is an extremely rare event for the FCC to threaten to revoke the license of an American broadcasting station. But a corporate owner can hardly put it out of his mind that the government has, at least theoretically, the right to put his enterprise out of business. The government does not have such a power over newspapers. Newspaper publishers and editors don't have to worry about this. Now, before you decide that this is so theoretical a problem as to be without substance, let me point out to you an interesting distortion of the American political system that has been brought about by the nervousness of broadcasters. Before broadcasting came into the picture, the President of the United States reported to Congress every year as required by the Constitution. He delivered his State of the Union message. Our forefathers felt that the President held a unique position. During an election campaign, he might be a candidate, but once elected, he becomes President of all the people. They felt that the Congress and the country should get an annual assessment from him about national affairs. The State of the Union message assigned to the President the role of national leader. It encouraged him to think in nonpartisan terms. He's appearing before the country not as a Democrat or as a Republican, but as President. It invited the voters, including those recently voting for the President's opponent, to accept him as spokesman for the national interest, for a unified country. Now what do we have? We have the President delivering his State of the Union message, followed immediately by the official reply from the opposing party. We are no longer hearing from the President of all the people. He's disappeared. We're hearing instead from the leader of the Democratic Party or the leader of the Republican Party, depending on who's in the White House at the moment. We have, in the handling of this ritual, informally but effectively amended the Constitution. We have, in effect, demoted the President, stripped him of his dignity and rank as the elected leader of the nation. The only special standing he has now is that he gets to give his annual message before the other party gives their annual message. We have diminished the constitutional provision symbolic of national unity. We have encouraged the Congress and all Americans not to think of the President as national leader. We have enshrined the spirit of partisanship and disunity. Why have we done this? Because a timid broadcasting industry, worried about not offending anyone, decided it would go the Constitution one better and give the other party equal time with the President. Down with the Constitution and the dignity it gave the President, up with equal time and not offending the opposition party. And on the weekends, we have the President's radio address and the opposition's reply. There's something pathetic about it. It's the kind of thing that happens when news media are afraid of the government and half the people in it. Today, in this election period, we have people calling on the television networks to carry live all of the presidential debates. When one network failed to carry the first debate and another provided it to affiliate stations on an optional basis, Newton Minnow's successor as head of the FCC, William Kennard, castigated them in a New York Times op-ed piece. And Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin said, perhaps this most recent outrage will convince Congress to consider determining more specifically what the broadcaster's public interest obligation should be. In other words, quite clearly, he was threatening the networks with a specific law forcing them to broadcast presidential debates, something the Congress cannot do to newspapers. I happen to think the networks should drop baseball or whatever and carry the debates, but not on the basis that they're under any compulsion to do it. It is not in the public interest for government to be able to compel American news media to carry debates or anything else. So NBC and Fox may have been wrong in their decisions on the first debate. I think they were. But I see a plus, nevertheless, something wholesome in one or two networks defying the notion that they're obligated to the government to carry the debates. There's also a good omen, by the way, in a federal court decision yesterday, which the New York Times noted on its front page this morning, a federal court decision which knocked down part of the FCC's so-called fairness rules, which actually attempted to make the government the ultimate judge of media fairness. As for all of those mindless newspaper people crying shame on NBC because that network gave its stations the option of carrying baseball, is it really a wonderful, great, unarguable idea, a thing beyond argument? for the government, backed by the newspapers, to force the American people to watch presidential debates by depriving them of all other television entertainment? Whatever happened to the idea of choice, which is so cherished in other contexts? Is there nothing to be said for those people who feel that, as opposed to watching Gore and Bush, they'd get a better night's sleep while watching wrestling? There may be a country somewhere where government pressure on the news media works well for the public, but this is not that country. Let me ask you to consider the one area in which newspaper journalism is clearly superior to television journalism. I had the fascinating experience of watching television come of age as a news medium. At Wdsu in the 1950s, I began to realize that television's handling of the news was gradually diversifying into exactly the same specialized departments newspapers had maintained for as long as anybody could remember. First, there was the all-purpose newscaster. The very first newscast on television, sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes, was handled by one person, invariably a male. This anchor person did everything, and he delivered the news. And before it ended, he delivered a note or two about sports, and then an item or so that came from the Weather Bureau about next day's weather. After a while, a few months or a year and a half, a specialist appeared to give a separate report on baseball, football, whatever. Then a weather person. The weather person today is likely a meteorologist. In those days, more likely a cheerful woman in a tight-fitting sweater. Television was not deliberately copying the newspapers. It was rediscovering for itself exactly what the people in this country were interested in, what specialized news. Eventually, television was presenting specialized coverage of sports, weather, business, foreign affairs, economics, military matters, science, health, etc. In short, every major category found in the newspaper, with one striking exception. Television does not duplicate that wonderful, lively, essential democratic institution called letters to the editor. Some television people will tell you that television is not adaptable to letters to the editor. Could not be farther from the truth. I happened to experiment with letters to the editor on the Today Show some years ago, and television is wonderfully adaptable to letters to the editor. You do not, however, have an anchor person read a little bit from somebody else's letter. You have the person who sent the letter in read the letter, himself or herself. You send a cameraman out to the person who wrote in the letter, and you get that person saying the gist of what he or she wants to say. You convert the letter into a television reality. We got a letter to NBC shortly after the convention that nominated, Democratic convention that nominated Walter Mondale as president and Geraldine Ferraro as vice president. We telephoned the writer of this letter and asked her, would you mind saying that for a film camera? She said, no, I wouldn't mind at all. So we sent a film camera out to her. I think it was somewhere in Ohio. She was a secretary. We showed her sitting at her desk, and she looked at the camera, and she said without a quaver that Tom Brokaw was being sexist when he identified Geraldine Ferraro's dress size. She said, if he's going to tell us her dress size, why doesn't he tell us about her shoe size and about the size of her foot and whether she keeps it in her mouth the way he does his? Now, friends, that is good television. It has the spice, it has the character that makes the letters in every American newspaper such a popular feature. And the letters, especially including the critical letters, make the newspapers look good. There is decency and fair play in giving your readers a chance to have their say. Television might be perceived as a little less arrogant if it gave some program time to its viewers to talk back to that new breed of celebrity journalists, the Brokaws, Rathers, Jennings, etc. I suspect that one reason television doesn't have a letters column or a letters segment is because Brokaw, Jennings, and Rather and their colleagues don't want to be talked back to, but it might do them a lot of good. I'm convinced at the same time that that's not the only reason. There is, I'm sure, another reason. Letters are an exercise in opinion. And American television grew up fearful of opinion, fearful that it could not handle opinion without getting into trouble with the Democrats or the Republicans, the liberals or the conservatives, or the FCC or the White House. So that vital American newspaper institution, the letters column that talks back to the journalist, adds information to the story, and honors the voice of the people, is totally missing from the unresponsive world of television news, which badly needs it. Now, I realize that at this point some of you are recalling and savoring the brevity of my grandson James, who dealt with his audience in 2 seconds by sticking his tongue out. Let me just leave you quickly with 3 thoughts. 1, please treat your friendly neighborhood journalist kindly. Consider the probability that underneath an obnoxious exterior, he or she is just an innocent romantic afflicted by wholesome curiosity. 2, the First Amendment protects our flow of information from government contamination. If it does not apply with equal vigor to every American distributor of news and information, to the old print media and the new electronic media, then we are losing the First Amendment. Whatever the technology, if a source delivers news to Americans, the government should not be able to influence it, coerce it, or intimidate it. 3, television journalists have good reason to believe that they operate on the same general level of quality as newspaper journalists. But television lacks one element essential to the moral authority of American newspapers, a way for the audience to comment, argue, and add its own insight. If and when television news establishes its own letters to the editor segment, it will become a fully mature, disciplined, and democratic news service. And it will widen its acceptance as American free press electronic division. Thank you.